Welcome to the second week of class here. I'm glad that you're back. I want to introduce to you the week's assignments first, and then I will talk you through a couple of different resources for trying to understand a bit about what we're doing a bit more. So first this week, I want you to be watching this video as well as another video on how to do your interest pieces and project descriptions, or your project, digital project. I'll describe those in a bit more detail in another place, but I just want you to watch that video so you can actually see that and see what you're preparing for. I want you to be reading the Backdoor Introduction to the Bible, this one. I want you to be looking at pages 8 through 44. And you're also going to be looking at Exodus, chapters 1 through 20, and then chapter 22, verse 16, through chapter 23, verse 33, and then chapter 32 in its entirety. I'm trying to get you a sense of the Exodus and about the story of the Israelite people being in Egypt, the Hebrew slaves, as they're often referred to. They don't really become Israelites until they settle in Israel, right? So they're really the Hebrew slaves in Egypt, their liberation out of slavery, their wandering in the wilderness, the giving of the law, the leadership of Moses and Miriam, as well as some others. And then the reality of what that means for the identity of the people of the book of Hebrews as well as Christians. I also want you to explore the Brick Bible and the Brick Testament. Those are on your assignment page. It's one way to think about what could a digital project look like. This couple of different people have actually reenacted a number of biblical scenes using Legos, which has made a fun little story. Another resource that you might be looking into as you just imagine what your digital project is going to be. And then complete your weekly discussion this week, as well as your first quiz. Read everything before you take your quiz. It is a reading quiz, so please read all of that you've been asked to read before you take your quiz. It's important to do that, and that will help you, I think, go through the discussion as well as take your quiz. And let's talk a bit about the book of Exodus. There are a number of visual depictions of the book. We've seen movies, pictures, songs, which are obviously not visual. They're auditory, they're oral. There are many different ways to think about this book, that this book has been seen, because it's such a formative piece of history. For instance, the story of the Exodus, of liberation, was adopted by the enslaved Africans in the United States, and it was actually a very formative way for them to adopt the Christian faith in a way that was liberating rather than oppressing. That's part of how we need to think about Scripture. It's not just a sense of how do these stories read, but how do faith communities use them? How do they become active in the lives of faith for these people? One of the reasons is because of compelling characters like Moses, this one whose name means drawn from the water, because he is left in the water in a baby basket, and he's drawn up, taken into Pharaoh's household, raised as one of the leaders of Egypt, until he realizes that his people were not the ruling class, but the class that had been enslaved. So what does he do? He flees first. He's afraid. He eventually responds to God's call for leadership. We see these number of plagues come. That's one of the very interesting pieces, right? Could these plagues really have happened? There are a number of scientific depictions that consider this at least possible, that if you follow the plagues one after another, there could be some relationship where these plagues existed in this way. So it's not something to write off as unhistorical at this point. The same can be true of the crossing of the Red Sea or the Reed Sea, if you pay attention to the way your book talks about it, and to the translation of the word there in Scripture. What's actually said is the crossing of the Reed Sea, which may have been this narrow portion of the Red Sea that was often known to dry up during odd times. And so if you've got all of these plagues, these odd astronomical events going on, you would suggest that there's actually some odd stuff going on geologically as well that could lead to the drying up of a particular part of a lake. And this is God's work in allowing the Hebrew slaves to be liberated. Maybe it's all historical. But even if it's not, look at how important that story has been to the development, as I said, of African American Christian identity, of the story of the people of Israel themselves, not just out of the Exodus originally, but when they are later cast out of Israel, coming around 587, 586 BC. They are people in diaspora. They've been sent out. They've been sent away from their homeland. So they once again are in an exodus, wandering in the wilderness. And they come back once again to their home. And then again, once Israel's taken over by Greco-Roman powers around originally the 2nd century BCE, and then finally Rome crushes the temple in 70 CE. The Exodus is something that remains a part of their identity. Reading over and again, you'll hear, why are we supposed to keep this command? Because remember, you were slaves in Egypt. That's what you'll hear God say over and again in the giving of the law. In other words, the Exodus is a story to know as one of the most foundational stories of Christian faith and of Jewish faith. I don't want to simply overtake the Jewish nature of this text, because the very highest and holy days of the Jewish calendar are drawn out of this, the Passover, where God passes over the firstborn children of the Jews because they have smeared the blood on their doorposts. Now, the Passover is seen as a promise still. It's seen as a different kind of promise, because there hasn't been sacrifice at the temple for 2,000 years. And yet God is still seen by the Jewish community and by the Christian community as one who is faithful to keep that promise that was made something like 4,000 years ago. That's kind of incredible that this kind of story, this kind of important foundational text has retained power for communities across literally millennia. The last thing I want you to pay attention to in these Exodus chapters are who are the main characters. We often just talk about Moses, but that's not true necessarily. We also see Aaron arise. We also see Miriam arise. We see a number of people who are formative in Moses' story, his father-in-law, his wife, other leaders of Israel that are raised up. Leadership in Christian communities is often viewed as just the pastor, just the one wearing the collar. But more and more in our culture, the case is being made that stories of Moses aren't really just about Moses. The Exodus is about the entire people of Israel and them taking ownership of this growing leadership. They followed the lead of God through Moses, but that Moses could not do it on his own. So, as you read, pay attention to those things. Explore the Brick Bible and the Brick Testament as potential ideas, as something to prime the pump for your digital project. Participate in the weekly discussion and then take the quiz last. Remember to complete it by the due date, which is in your syllabus and on Canvas. But be sure that the quiz is done after you read. Do your reading. I'm giving you this huge hint that the answers are in your reading, so just do the reading and you should be all right. If you have any questions, you know how to get in touch. Get a hold of me and let me know. Thanks.